church, a sacred place, a sanctuary where souls seek refuge, a gathering of the faithful, a house of light and prayer. But what if the walls of this holy haven conceal something darker? What if the place meant to offer protection becomes the very source of terror? They say a church is where spirits can find peace, but not all spirits are so easily trusted. What happens when you open your heart to the wrong one? When the person you confide in hides sinister intentions behind a mask of faith? In this episode of Creepy Conjures, we uncover what happens when sacred becomes sinister, when faith is twisted, and safety is nothing but an illusion. Welcome to Creepy Conjures. Tonight's tale begins now. Story number 1. I wasn't always afraid of church. In fact, for most of my life, the idea of religion was abstract, a quiet thing that existed in the background. My parents weren't devout. They didn't drag us to Sunday service, nor did they preach scripture at home. We were an average family living in an average town. Religion was something distant, something for others. But that all changed when I met Emma. Emma was one of those girls who seemed to have it all together, calm, collected, never a hair out of place. She transferred to my school a few months ago, and we quickly became friends. She was new in town, so we bonded over the awkwardness of being outsiders. Me, an introverted girl who barely had any friends, and Emma, this ethereal, enigmatic presence who radiated an odd warmth. Despite the difference in our personalities, I was drawn to her like a moth to a flame. I remember the day she invited me to her church. It was a small, almost hidden building on the edge of town, tucked behind rows of trees as though it were hiding from the world. There was something about it that unsettled me, but Emma spoke so highly of it. She said it brought her peace, a sense of belonging, and I, naive and eager to be part of something, agreed to go. The first service was odd. At first glance, it seemed like any other church, a small congregation of people singing hymns, smiling, clasping their hands in prayer. But there was an intensity in their eyes that I couldn't quite shake off. The preacher, Pastor Ezekiel, spoke with such fervor, his voice a thunderous wave crashing over the pews. There was a strange electricity in the air that made my skin crawl, but Emma looked so serene, so at ease, that I convinced myself I was imagining it. "Come again," she whispered to me after the service. "You'll see, you'll feel it." I wasn't sure what it was, but I wanted to find out. Soon, attending became a regular thing. My parents noticed, of course. At first, they were skeptical. They'd never been particularly religious, but when I spoke about how much it meant to me, how it helped me feel connected, they decided to give it a try. They attended a service, and just like me, they were swept up in the intensity, in the community. Pastor Ezekiel had this way of speaking that made you feel special, chosen, part of something greater. My parents, who had always been so grounded, so practical, began to change. They started talking about the church constantly, quoting scripture, and attending every event. Before I knew it, they were fully committed. They tithed more than they could afford. They volunteered their weekends. It was as though the church had wrapped its tendrils around their hearts, pulling them deeper into its grasp. And I felt lost. The sermons became more aggressive, more apocalyptic. Pastor Ezekiel began talking about evil lurking among us, about how the devil disguised himself in familiar faces. He preached about possession, about sin festering in the hearts of the unsuspecting. That's when the whispers started. I noticed it first when I caught Emma glancing at me during a sermon, her eyes wide with something like fear. At first I thought I'd imagined it, but then I overheard conversations between the congregation members, small secretive whispers that ceased the moment I approached. Something was wrong, but I couldn't pinpoint it. Then came the night my parents sat me down at the dinner table, their faces grave. I remember how my mother's hand trembled as she held mine, how my father's eyes didn't meet mine when he spoke. "Pastor Ezekiel says there's something wrong, Dora," he said softly. "He says you've been touched by something evil." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. "What?" I stammered, pulling my hand back. "What are you talking about?" My mother's eyes filled with tears. "It's not your fault, sweetheart. The pastor says it can happen to anyone. We just want to help you." They truly believed it. I could see the fear in their eyes, the blind faith that had overtaken them. Pastor Ezekiel had convinced them that I was possessed, that something dark and evil had attached itself to me. I tried to argue, tried to tell them how absurd it all was, but they wouldn't listen. They had already made up their minds. "We're going to help you," my father said. "We're going to bring you to the church. Pastor Ezekiel says there's a way to exorcise the evil." The days leading up to that moment felt like a nightmare. I was watched constantly, by my parents, by members of the church. They said they were keeping me safe, but I felt trapped. My phone was taken away, my every move scrutinized. I started to believe I was losing my mind. I wasn't allowed to leave the house. The church members visited regularly, bringing prayers and holy water. My parents looked at me with a mixture of fear and pity, like I was some sort of ticking time bomb. Then, just when I thought there was no escape, my brother came home. Ethan had been away at college for months. He wasn't particularly religious. If anything, he was the complete opposite. He'd always been the skeptic in the family, the one who questioned everything. When he walked through the door, I'd never been so relieved in my life. "What the hell is going on?" he asked, his voice sharp as he looked around the house, taking in the strange, oppressive atmosphere. Our parents tried to explain, but Ethan wasn't having it. "Possession? Exorcism? Are you hearing yourselves?" He didn't give them time to respond. Instead, he grabbed me by the arm, pulled me out the door and told me to get in the car. Ethan didn't take me home. Instead, he drove me to his college campus, far enough away from the town and its suffocating church. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe. We stayed at his apartment for a few days. He kept asking me what had happened, trying to understand how our parents had fallen so deep into the church's clutches. I told him everything. The sermons, the whispers, the accusations of possession. Ethan was furious, but more than that, he was determined. "We're not going back," he said firmly. "Not until they come to their senses." For days, there was radio silence from our parents. Ethan tried calling them, but they wouldn't pick up. When they finally did, they were distant, cold. It was like they were still under the church's spell. But something changed. I'm not sure what it was. Maybe it was the distance. Maybe it was time. But slowly, they began to reach out again. First, it was just a text from my mum. Then a phone call. Eventually, they came to see us in person. The look on their faces was a mixture of shame and exhaustion. They told us they had left the church. It wasn't easy, but they had begun to see through the manipulation, through the fear that Pastor Ezekiel had instilled in them. They apologized, over and over again, for what they had put me through. It took time, but eventually, we healed. Our family became whole again, but the memory of that place, the church, the whispers, the fear, never left me. Even now, years later, I can still feel its shadow lingering at the edge of my mind. And sometimes, late at night, I swear I can still hear the whispers. Story number 2. I've always loved church. It was my refuge, a place where my friends and I could hang out, pray, and feel safe. It wasn't just a weekly ritual, it was part of who I was, woven into my routine since I could remember. The summer before 9th grade, though, I felt a shift. A dark cloud began creeping into what was once my safe space, and it all started on what should have been a typical Wednesday night service. That night, the air inside the sanctuary was warm and familiar. My parents and I arrived early as usual, and after grabbing some lemonade and cookies from the fellowship hall, we joined the crowd in the main area. The pews were filled with the faces I knew, all engaged in soft chatter before the service began. I could see my friend Jessica across the room, her head bent as she texted on her phone, and my youth group leader, Mrs. Donovan, preparing her notes at the front. The service began, and I felt at peace. We prayed, sang hymns, and listened to the pastor's sermon, just like always. Afterward, everyone mingled, as they did after every service. I was talking to a few of the younger girls when I noticed someone I didn't recognize. He was thin, almost frail-looking, with thinning hair and a pale face. His clothes were worn, and he stood out because he wasn't someone I had ever seen before. I watched as he made his way through the congregation, introducing himself to different people. Eventually, he reached our group. Hello, he stuttered, his voice shaky as he offered his hand to shake. I'm D. David. I hesitated, but, not wanting to seem rude, extended my hand. His grip was firm, too firm, and he held on for just a little too long. His hands were cold and clammy, and his eyes seemed to linger on me. I'm Kimberly, I said, pulling my hand away a bit too forcefully, trying to hide my discomfort. David nodded, still staring at me for a beat too long before shifting his attention to the others. One of the older church members, Mrs. Jenkins, walked over and greeted him with a warm smile. Kimberly, this is my brother, she explained, patting him on the back. He's just moved back into town. Isn't it nice to have him join us tonight? I nodded politely, but something about David unsettled me. Maybe it was the way his eyes followed me, or how he kept fidgeting with his hands. He seemed shy, almost harmless, but there was something beneath the surface that made me uneasy. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the memory of his cold, lingering handshake. The next time I saw David, it was completely by chance. It was a Saturday afternoon, and I had gone to the pharmacy with my mum. We were picking up a prescription, and as I waited for her by the entrance, I spotted him near the back of the store. He was hovering near the shelves, his eyes scanning the aisles, but the moment he saw me, his face lit up. Kimberly, he stuttered, shuffling over to me with an awkward smile. I didn't expect to see you here. Hey, I said, trying to keep my tone neutral. It felt odd seeing him outside of church. He was just as jittery as before, wringing his hands and glancing around nervously. I'm just, getting some things, he mumbled. Do you come here often? Sometimes, I replied, hoping the conversation would end soon. Before I could say more, my mum called me over, and I was thankful for the escape. I could feel his eyes on me as I left, a prickling sensation crawling up my spine. I convinced myself it was just a coincidence, that he was harmless like everyone said. Still, something about him bothered me. A week later, I saw him again. This time, I was at a local fast food restaurant with my friends, laughing and chatting over burgers and fries. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw him sitting alone in a booth by the window, staring at me. His presence made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Isn't that the guy from church? Jessica asked, following my gaze. Yeah, I muttered, feeling a lump form in my throat. He waved when he saw me notice him, his thin lips curving into an awkward smile. I forced myself to wave back, but my stomach churned. The more I saw him, the more I started to feel like it wasn't just coincidence. He always seemed so delighted to see me, like he had been waiting for it. It wasn't long before I saw him again, this time closer to home. I had stayed late at school for a club meeting, and as I walked home, I caught a glimpse of someone darting between parked cars. My heart skipped a beat, when I realized it was David, crouching behind a car, his eyes locked on me. Panic surged through me, and I quickened my pace, my heart pounding in my chest. I made it home without him following, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he had been watching me, waiting for me. That night, I told my parents about it. "He's just shy, Kimberly," my dad said, brushing off my concerns. "You said he's Mrs. Jenkins' brother, right? He's probably harmless." "But he was hiding behind cars, Dad," I protested. "It was weird." "Maybe it's just a coincidence," my mum added gently. "I'm sure he didn't mean anything by it." I wasn't convinced, but I didn't push it further. Maybe they were right. Maybe I was overreacting. But the uneasy feeling that settled in my gut wouldn't go away. A couple of weeks later, the church was hosting a lock-in for the youth group. It was something we did every year, a night spent at the church, playing games, watching movies, and bonding. It was supposed to be fun, and I was looking forward to it. The evening started off great. We ate pizza, played board games, and told ghost stories. By midnight, most of the adults had gone to sleep in the side rooms, leaving us kids to stay up as long as we wanted. I finally crashed around 2 a.m., curling up in my sleeping bag on the floor of the youth room with the other girls. I don't know what woke me up, but when I opened my eyes, everything felt wrong. The room was dark, and the only sound was the soft breathing of the others sleeping around me. My heart skipped a beat when I realized there was someone lying next to me, someone who hadn't been there when I fell asleep. It was David. He was lying on his side, his face inches from mine, his breath hot against my skin. I opened my mouth to scream, but before I could make a sound, his hand shot out, covering my mouth. "Don't scream," he whispered, his voice a trembling hiss. Please, don't scream." Terror surged through me, and I thrashed against him, trying to break free, but his grip was strong. He dragged me out of my sleeping bag, pulling me toward one of the side rooms. My heart pounded in my chest, and I could barely breathe through the panic. He dragged me into the small room and pushed me against the wall. My mind was racing, my body frozen with fear. But then, I saw it. The door on the other side of the room. It led to the kitchen. With every ounce of strength I had, I broke free from his grasp and bolted for the door. I could hear him stumbling behind me, his frantic stuttering filling the air as he tried to catch me. I made it into the kitchen and slammed the door behind me, locking it. My hands were shaking so badly that I almost couldn't turn the lock on the second door, but I managed to do it just in time. For what felt like an eternity, I crouched in the corner of the kitchen, listening to him pound on the door, his fists hammering against the wood as he stammered incoherently. I was too scared to move, too scared to even cry. I just sat there, curled up on the cold tile floor, praying that someone would wake up. Finally, after what felt like hours, the pounding stopped. Silence filled the air, and I could hear the soft sounds of people stirring in the other rooms. The adults were waking up. I bolted out of the kitchen, running to the others, my heart still racing. When I told everyone what had happened, no one could believe it. My friends were horrified, the adults shocked. My parents rushed to the church as soon as they heard, and I was taken to the police station to file a report. David was arrested, and we filed a restraining order against him. But even after he was gone, I couldn't shake the fear he had planted in me. Church didn't feel safe anymore. My family started distancing themselves from it, and eventually, we stopped going altogether. The sanctuary that had once been my refuge was now tainted, haunted by the memory of that night. Even now, I sometimes wake up in the middle of the night, my heart pounding, convinced I can still hear the sound of his fists on the door, his voice stuttering in the dark. Story number 3. Moving into our first apartment felt like the beginning of a new chapter, a fresh start for both of us. Jonathan and I had been friends since middle school, and we'd finally gotten into the same college. It wasn't just the start of our academic careers. It felt like our entire lives were kicking off. The apartment complex was nothing fancy, but it was more than what we needed. A roof over our heads, our own space, and a quick walk to campus. We moved in on a hot August afternoon, sweat pouring from every pore as we hauled boxes and furniture into our new 2-bedroom place. The building had an old charm, but there was something slightly off about it. Nothing we could put our finger on. Maybe it was the creaky hallways, or the faint smell of mildew in the air, or maybe it was just the sheer eeriness of being in a new environment. Our neighbours seemed odd, but maybe that was just us being nervous about moving into such a different place. The couple across the hall, Sarah and Marcus, waved to us as we carried in the last of our boxes. "New blood," Marcus called out with a laugh, but his smile seemed to fade quickly. "I mean new neighbours." Sarah gave him a look, and they both chuckled awkwardly. Jonathan and I exchanged glances but shrugged it off. People were weird sometimes, right? After a couple of days, we finally felt settled in. The apartment was shaping up nicely, and the routine of class schedules began. Nothing too dramatic, just the mundane adjustments of college life. One evening, after a particularly grueling day of classes, we ran into Marcus and Sarah in the hallway again. They were friendly enough, asking us about how we were settling in and how school was going. This time, though, the conversation took a different turn. "You guys ever go to church?" Marcus asked casually, adjusting the collar of his black leather jacket. Jonathan and I both nodded. "Yeah," I replied. "Our families are regular churchgoers. Why do you ask?" "Well, there's a church we go to not far from here," Sarah chimed in. "It's got a great community, and we thought maybe you'd want to come along this Sunday. It's always nice to meet new people." Jonathan and I looked at each other. We'd been talking about how we wanted to get more involved socially, meet people, and try to feel more at home here. A church community seemed like the perfect way to do that. Plus, our families were religious, so it didn't seem out of place. "We're in," Jonathan said, before I could even respond. "We could use a bit of community right now." Sarah smiled, but again, there was something in her eyes that seemed off. I shook it off, telling myself I was being paranoid. "Great," she said, clapping her hands together. "We'll pick you up Sunday morning, 10 a.m. That Sunday, true to their word, Marcus and Sarah knocked on our door at 10 sharp. They seemed even more excited than we were, but there was still that faint undercurrent of tension I couldn't shake. I didn't say anything, though. I figured it was just nerves about meeting new people. As we drove, the scenery gradually shifted. The city streets gave way to more rural, isolated areas. The church wasn't in town as I'd expected. It was out in the countryside, tucked away at the end of a long gravel driveway surrounded by dense woods. We pulled up to the building, and for the first time, Jonathan seemed to sense something was off too. The church was nothing like what we'd expected. It was a large Gothic structure, its dark stone walls covered in ivy. The windows were stained glass, but they depicted strange, unsettling images. Nothing like the peaceful scenes of saints or angels you usually saw in churches. Marcus and Sarah led us inside. There were no pews, no altar. Instead, the main hall was filled with rows of old wooden chairs set up in a circle. In the center of the room was a raised platform with an ornate black metal podium. The walls were adorned with strange symbols, pentagrams and other designs I couldn't make sense of. "Where's the cross?" Jonathan whispered to me. I shrugged, my heart pounding in my chest. A tall man dressed in a long dark robe approached us. He had a shaved head and piercing eyes that seemed to look straight through us. "Welcome," he said, his voice deep and commanding. "I'm Father Lucian. It's always wonderful to see new faces." Before we could respond, He gestured for us to take a seat. Marcus and Sarah were already seated, watching us with strange, expectant smiles. I hesitated, but Jonathan nudged me forward, and we sat. The service began, and it was unlike anything we'd ever experienced. The prayers were more like chants, spoken in a language I didn't recognize. People around us were swaying, their eyes closed, murmuring the strange words under their breath. The air grew thick with incense, a sickly sweet smell that made my stomach churn. Then, Father Lucien began his sermon, but instead of talking about love or forgiveness, he spoke about power, darkness, and chaos. He talked about embracing the shadows within ourselves and rejecting the false light of the world. As he spoke, the atmosphere in the room grew darker, more oppressive. Jonathan and I exchanged nervous glances. This wasn't a church, it was something else entirely. The symbols, the chants, the way everyone seemed entranced, it all clicked into place. We were in a satanic church. I nudged Jonathan again, harder this time. We had to leave. Now. But as I shifted in my seat, I felt eyes on us. Marcus and Sarah were watching us closely, their smiles now completely gone, replaced by something far more sinister. Father Lucien's voice grew louder, more intense, as if he were building up to something. The room felt like it was closing in on us, the air so thick it was hard to breathe. "We need to get out of here," I whispered to Jonathan, my voice barely audible over the chanting. "Now," he agreed. We stood up slowly, trying not to draw attention to ourselves, but it was too late. Father Lucien paused mid-sentence, his eyes locking onto us. "Leaving so soon?" he asked, his voice dripping with false kindness. The entire congregation turned to look at us. Jonathan grabbed my arm. "Yeah, sorry. We just remembered we have something we need to take care of." For a moment, no one moved. The room was deathly silent, and I could feel the weight of everyone's gaze on us. Then, to our surprise, Father Lucien smiled. "Of course," he said smoothly. "You're free to go whenever you like." The tension in the room didn't ease as we quickly made our way to the door. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Every step felt like a mile, and I half expected someone to grab us from behind before we could make it out. But no one did. We reached the door, pushed it open, and stepped out into the cool night air. The relief was immediate, but we didn't stop moving until we were back in the car. As we drove away, neither of us said a word. The eerie silence between us was louder than anything Father Lucien had said during the service. We didn't need to talk. We both knew we had narrowly escaped something far darker than we could have ever imagined. Weeks passed, and we tried to put the experience behind us. We avoided Marcus and Sarah as much as possible, but something about them still lingered in the back of our minds. They didn't seem angry when we saw them in the hallways, just patient, like they were waiting for something. Then, a few months later, the headlines hit the local news. Bodies found in satanic ritual at abandoned church. Several arrested, including local residents. My blood ran cold as I saw the mugshots of Marcus and Sarah, their faces twisted into unrecognizable versions of the people we'd once shared casual conversations with. They were among those arrested for their involvement in the murders of several people during a ritual sacrifice. Jonathan and I didn't need to say it out loud. We both knew that if we had stayed that night, we might have been next.